Oh boy, I'm on screen by myself now. Hi, everybody. I have that it is 12:58 East Coast time, so I'll just give people a couple extra minutes to come on. I hope you guys are having a wonderful conference. Aren't these talks amazing today? I'm really enjoying them. So if you are here for my talk, which if you're here, then you're in the right place if you're here for my talk. If you're not here for my talk, you should check the schedule because I'm here now. But I would love to know where you're watching from. And yeah, just let me know where in the world you are. I'm curious where people are watching from. I myself am in southern Spain right now, where it is a thundery day. Hi, Caroline. Indianapolis, Boston, Raleigh. My stepbrother lives in Raleigh. It's really nice there. Buckinghamshire. Awesome. Awesome, awesome. All right. 6:59, 12:59. Manchester. Manchester, England, across the Atlantic Sea. I always bring things back to musicals. Why not? Woot, another Caroline. Oakville, Ontario. I've been listening to my podcast for years. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Thank you. 6. Okay, I have 7 o'clock for me. 6 o'clock in the UK. 1 o'clock on the East Coast. Williamsburg, Virginia. All right. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to share my screen. And I have a PowerPoint, but it's mostly going to be me. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And then the thing is, I'm probably not going to be able to see the chat. Allow. Whoa, see there, it's all going to happen. So got a new window here. Otto, I'm assuming that people just see my my PDF image here now. You'll come on and tell me if they don't, I hope, so that I'm just talking nonsense and nobody can see anything. All right, so, okay. Hopefully, you all see my screen, and that's that. So, let me just see if there's anything coming in here from Otto telling me that it's not working. There's not. Awesome. All right, so hi everybody. You are in the session on from the Tower of London, and I'm Heather. For those of you who don't know me, I started the Renaissance English History podcast, and I'm sorry I'm American, I say Renaissance, not Renaissance. I started it in 2009, and yeah, it was just a hobby. The Tudors were on TV. It was the 500th anniversary of Henry VIII's reign, and I thought it would be fun to learn how to podcast, and here we are 12 years later. So that's who I am. So we're going to talk today about escapes from the Tower of London, particularly during the Tudor period. The Tower of London, here's a little backstory on it, founded towards the end of 1066. When William the Conqueror came over, he wanted to have like this sign of his strength and imposition. And so he started building the Tower of London. The White Tower was built in 1078, represented the repression of the new regime, right? So we think of the Tower of London as this place where there's a lot of torture happening and kind of unpleasant things, but it was predominantly a royal palace. It was also a prison, also a mint. There was a menagerie. I did a podcast episode maybe 3 years ago on the Tower Menagerie. At one point, there was a polar bear there. All kinds of animals lived in the Tower of London. Also, public records office, armory. So there was more to the Tower of London than simply the prison side of it. The first prisoner, though, that's what we're talking about today. The first prisoner was Ranulph Flambard. He was imprisoned in 1100. He was the Bishop of Durham. He had been found guilty of extortion. He had actually been improving some of the Tower of London. The original architect moved to Rochester. And so there's this story of he had some wine smuggled into him and some rope, and he wound up getting his guards really drunk. He threw a party for them, got his guards super drunk. After they passed out asleep, he climbed down the rope to escape, and he had some accomplices waiting with him or waiting for him, where they had a boat with some of his money and his mother, and they took them all to Normandy, and there he served Henry I's brother, Robert. So that was the first escape. So that's just what, 20 years after the White Tower was built. So it seems like ever since the White Tower's been there, people have been trying to escape from the tower. I'm going to tell you two big stories, though, of Tudor stories of people who tried to escape, one successfully, one almost successfully. And the first one is Alice Tankerville Wolfe. So Alice Tankerville Wolfe is a really interesting woman. She was probably a prostitute. She was a pirate. She was all kinds of an interesting person. But her story starts in October of 1531. Henry VIII was getting some money sent to him from the Hanseatic League. And so he had sent some people down to the docks to wait for the ship to arrive with the money. It was worth about £1 million. And when the ship arrived, it turned out that the of money, which had been bolted to the floor, locked under constant guard, was empty. And of course, there's an investigation launched into what happened to this money, to all of this stuff. And the investigation seemed to point after 2 years to a fellow called John Wolfe. He was a thief. He was a pirate. He was an all-around just kind of thuggy person, not really somebody that you want to be friends with. There wasn't much connecting him to the thief or to the theft, but the Hanseatic League insisted that he be put in prison because they were really upset about this, of course. And so he was taken to the Tower. He awaited arraignment on charges of conspiracy, theft, and treason. Not a good thing. Alice was his wife. She was his common law wife. Some people say they weren't married. How much they were married is up for debate. But either way, she would come and visit him. She would. Of course, at this point in history, people had to pay for their own food and for their own comforts when they were being kept in the prison. So she would bring him clothing and treats and things like that. She was very, very charming. And she made friends with some of her husband's guard, particularly William Dennis and John Bald. And, they would flirt and just kind of get along and have a good time. So Wolfe was in prison for 6 months, and then the case against him fell apart. So he got released and he up and left the country, which was smart, and he left for Ireland. He left Alice back in London, not particularly smart, but he did ask Baud to watch over her while he was gone. So after he leaves, there's some new evidence that turns up that really positively links him to the theft. And it also links Alice as an accomplice. So the Hanseatic League wanted to act really, really quickly. And rather than try and hunt him down, they just said, let's try him right now. And so they tried him in absentia. And they also tried Alice. And so meanwhile, Alice is going to the Tower on a regular basis. She's visiting her friend Baud. She's having a good time visiting with the people that she met while she was there. And she's being tried and found guilty in absentia this whole time, and she didn't even know. So she was found guilty without ever having even been notified. And then there was a warrant for her arrest, of course. Well, Alice was still at large, and then Wolfe comes back because, again, they don't know exactly what's going on. They didn't realize that they were found guilty. And during the time that he'd been away, Alice had befriended 2 very wealthy merchants, and she had actually even gone into their chambers and seen what was in their chambers. And her and Wolfe came up with a plan that they were going to lure the men to the river and kill them on their boats. chained them and dropped them into the water. And they were found, and it was really clear that they had been murdered. Because the crime had happened on the water, Alice officially became a pirate. They took the keys from the men, broke into their homes to rob the stuff that had been in their homes, and they were caught in the act and arrested. So back to the tower they go. And one of the prosecutors actually pleaded with Cromwell at the time. He said, "If the diabolic woman escapes, we shall be in great jeopardy." So Alice was diabolical. She was confined to the Cold Harbor Tower, and she was actually put in chains. Because they were pirates, they were tried in the Admiralty Court, and they were sentenced to hang upon the Thames at low water mark in chains, and then the rising tide would drown them, which would be horrifying. To avoid this fate, this wasn't going to be a thing she was going to go to willingly. So she kind of started to play on the sympathy of all the guards who were around her, who liked her, the people who'd gotten to know her. And her treatment was really harsh. And so people kind of started to help her. And one of the servants, well, Dennis, gave her an idea of how she might escape. And eventually her chains were taken off and she was just in her cell. And she was harming her guards. The one of them had actually been dismissed because he was fraternizing with the prisoner. But she started to come up with this idea of how they could get away. And she had some thoughts on, because Dennis had told her some things, she had some ideas of how they could get away. So John Baud has his schedule changed so that he was Alice's guard almost every day. And they came up with a plan. He actually brought her some ropes, he brought her some men's clothing, and he a plan. So on the 23rd of March, 1534, there was a new moon. It was completely dark. Alice was able to get out of her cell. They say it was almost comically ill secured, with only a bit of old bone acting to pin it shut. So she was able to reach under her cell door, and she shook it and was able to poke it, and she got herself out. Now, Baud knew all the schedules, and so they waited for just the perfect time when the one schedule, the shift happened, and he knew there would be a little bit of a break. So she meets him on the top of St. Thomas's Tower. They climb down to a boat that he had waiting, and they row across the moat, because there was a moat around the tower then, and they kind of head towards where Tower Bridge is now. And he had some horses lined up ready from a friend of his. And so the plan was that they were going to go get these horses close to where stock is, and they were going to ride their horses to stay with his friend's house for a couple of days, and then they were going to go to Europe, where they were going to start this new future together, or maybe meet up with Wolfe, or who knows. But either way, they were going to hang out for a couple of days, wait for things to cool down, and then go to Europe. Alice was wearing these men's clothing. She looked like a man. Things just seemed like they were going to be going well. Nobody saw them. It was all happening for Alice. And one of the groups of guards came early, about 10 minutes before they were supposed to come. And one of the guards recognized Baud and was like, "Hey, mate, what are you doing?" And Baud's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm just chilling, just hanging out here with this other person who's definitely a man, totally a man, nothing suspicious, nothing to see." But the guards realized one of the guards who was in that group had actually been Alice's guard before and recognized her. And pretty soon, they're all back in the tower. Things did not go well for John Baud because he was a guard, and so he was actually put into this cell Little Ease, which was a sort of a torture cell. It wasn't big enough that you could stand up straight or lie down, so you had to be perpetually in this kind of fetal position, not comfortable. He was also racked as part of his punishment. And they wanted to know whether or not any outside force had acted with them, or if this was just a plan that they had come up with themselves. And he repeatedly told his questioners that it was just because he was so in love with Alice, and it was just an idea that they had come up with. They didn't get any other information out of him. So he was hanged. But Alice and John Wolfe met the fate that she had tried to avoid. Edward Hall, the chronicler, records their ends and says, "And at last she and her husband, as they deserved, were apprehended, and hanged at the foresaid turning tree, where she hanged still and was not cut down until such time as it is known that beastly and filthy wretches had most shamefully abused her while being dead. So, the scavengers and animals and stuff. So, very unpleasant end for Alice, but she made a very brave attempt at getting away and came so close. It was just these guards had arrived earlier. So, she wasn't a nice person. And so, she needed to have justice, but part of me just can't help but root for Alice because, you just kind of wanted her to make it. At least I did. But in the end, she didn't. So next one, Father John Gerard. He escaped from the tower with citrus fruit. So that's a fun way to open. He was a Catholic priest, and he called it during the last era of the declining and gasping world. He was a Jesuit priest. He secretly served the Catholics in England, and this is when the Catholics were being very persecuted under Elizabeth I. I think actually in the last Intelligence Speech Conference, I talked about the Catholic experience in Elizabethan England, and it's something that I find very interesting. So this is when Catholics were being persecuted, and particularly because people weren't sure of their loyalty. Could you be loyal to the Pope and Elizabeth even after the Pope had declared her illegitimate? So that's the kind of context of what's going on with the Jesuit priests. So he studied at the English Jesuit College in France. He went to Oxford, then he went back to Paris. He was going back and forth. He was a really intelligent, very learned man. Spent the first 20 years of his life just kind of studying and learning. And then things kind of take and get interesting. He came back to England to be a missionary priest. And these are the kind of priests who would travel in secret and live in hiding spaces, live with families that everybody knew were friendly to the Catholics. And so he wanted to kind of serve the Catholic community that way. He says, with some other Catholics, I set sail. The wind, however, was against us. And after 5 days at sea, we were forced into port at Dover. There we were arrested by the guards and customs officials and sent to London under custody. The others were imprisoned by warrant of the Queen's Privy Council, but although I confessed myself a Catholic and refused to attend service, I was left free. So a lot of people wanted to be this was the time where it was still sort of early and the Armada hadn't come yet and things were kind of ramping up, but they thought that maybe it would just be a matter of time before they won him back over. They wanted to win his heart and his mind and not go really heavy-handed at first. So then the Bishop of London sent him a letter and asked whether he was ready to discuss his religion. And Father John Gerard said that he didn't want to debate his religion. And so then the bishop said, okay, well, now we're going to make you a prisoner. He wasn't in the tower yet, but he was treated with kindness, but he was a prisoner of the Bishop of London. They wanted these debates, and Father John Gerard said no, he wasn't down to debate. He was released in 1584. He went to the English College in Rome then, and he was ordained in 1588 into the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and then he came back to England. So they landed in Norfolk. It was a bunch of Catholics who were all together. They landed in Norfolk and he was left on the beach, and they split up and started making their way around to be country gentlemen and converting people back to Catholicism. And at one point, he was with a family and some guards came, the police came, and he had to hide. So he went into one of these priest hides, something similar to this is one that Nicholas Owen had built. I don't think he was in a Nicholas Owen one at this point, but he was in a hiding place. And he wrote, I'd gotten into it by raising part of the floor under the fireplace grate, was made of wood and brick and constructed in such a way that a fire could not be lit in it without damaging the house. But wood was kept there as though it were meant for a fire at night. So the men on guard decided to light a fire in the grate, and they sat down to talk for a few minutes, and then the bricks, which were not lit, actually bricks, but laid on wood, they almost fell out of position. And so this fire kind of started and threatened the whole house. had to put it out, and the men noticed it, and they said, well, that's really weird that there's, this fireplace that's not actually a fireplace. And at that point, he thought he was going to be discovered, but he wasn't. Eventually he was, though. And this is like way longer, and I know I'm running short of time, so I'm glossing over a big part of his life, but he did write his autobiography. You can read it. He was eventually arrested. They tortured him. So he talks about his torture. They hung him very high from a pillar, and asked him if he was willing to confess his sins, and he wasn't. So he was put in the Tower of London, and he said even though he was tempted, he never actually gave in and gave them the information that they wanted. He did have friends who were able to get some money to him, and he had a sympathetic jailer. He asked his jailer if he could buy some oranges, and the jailer bought him some oranges. And at this point, his hands were very, very weak because of having the torture that had been done. So he had to exercise his hands. So he drew little crucifixes into the oranges, and he made little rosary beads out of the orange peels. And so all this time, he was also keeping the juice from the oranges and putting them into a very small jar. And so it took him close to 5 months to be able to hold a pen in his hand because of the weakness of his hands. And he didn't want to ask for a pen because he thought it was obvious, but he asked for a quill that he could use on his teeth, like brushing his teeth. And he sharpened it into a point and made a pen with it. And then he started writing letters to his friends. And he started writing with orange juice, which is the very earliest invisible ink. So he would write the actual letters in charcoal, and then in between the lines, he would write the real letters. And so he'd write these secret messages. And then they would respond by sending him letters back with orange juice. So they communicated like this for a long time. Eventually, he was also able to meet up with another prisoner, another Catholic who had a room that was very close to a creek right by the tower where there was a good escape route. And so they were kind of talking and trying to get letters back and forth. And again, the jailers were pretty sympathetic to them. John Gerard was a very sympathetic kind of figure. And so they let these letters go back and forth because they didn't think it was hurting anything. So he was able to use the orange juice and tell his friends that he had this to escape, and they arranged a rescue attempt. So the first rescue attempt didn't work. They were going to wait at the bottom and with a boat and then row them to freedom. But there were too many currents that first night, and they weren't able to get the rope up to his room. But then they tried the next day. They knew what room he was going to be up, or that he was going to be in, and they threw a rope up into the room, and then they climbed back down. And so then Father John Gerard climbs down the rope, and he writes his autobiography. It's so frightening, this story, because his hands were still so weak, and he was taking this rope not just down the actual wall, but across the creek as well. So it was like at an angle. And so he said his body was swinging around and he almost fell. His hands were so weak. But at last, he managed to work himself as far as the middle of the rope, and there he was stuck. He says, my strength was failing in my breath, which was short before it seemed altogether. He was able to escape, though. And this guy was just so tough. Rather than leave the country, he stayed in England, and he continued to do his work and preach and convert people, and was never caught. And he converted people back to Catholicism, and this was like what he saw as his real mission. And eventually the talk of his escape died down, and so he was able to continue on with his work. But then he was implicated in the gunpowder plot, although he said that he knew nothing about it. And I'm inclined to believe him because I don't know. I'm inclined to believe him. But he was able to get out of England at that point. He was disguised as a foot soldier in the retinue of a Spanish ambassador. He wrote his autobiography, and he managed to die an old man. He lived until he was 73, and he died in the English College Seminary in Rome. And that's the cover of his autobiography, the Autobiography of a Hunted Priest. So a total of 40 prisoners have escaped from the Tower of London. 40 people over the last, 900 years or whatever. One that did not go well was Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, tried to escape. He was one of Henry VIII's final victims in 1546-47. He tried to escape through the toilet, through his garter robe, which led to the river. This is actually debated among historians. one mention of it in the Spanish Chronicle, but I think it's a cool story, so I am saying it. The most recent escapee was actually in 1945, when Private L.C. Wheeler of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Escape Infantry appears to have struck an officer and simply walked out of the tower while imprisoned, awaiting a court-martial. So that's the newspaper clipping. So that is my story on tower escape. So now what I'm going to do is go back. I think maybe it's going to look wonky for a little bit until I say stop sharing my screen. Where's the stop sharing my screen? Yeah, there we go. So now I'm going to go through the questions. How could the orange juice meet? Yeah, so you would have the heat from the candle and then it would be made visible from the orange or the lemon juice. So happened to the guy that tried to get out by the toilet? Well, the Spanish Chronicle says that he was captured and he was brought by. He was eventually killed. He and his father were both supposed to have been killed. His father wound up surviving the old Howard. He survived Henry VIII. Henry VIII died before the execution could go on, but his son, the Earl of Surrey, was Henry VIII's final victim. There's actually a book by Jessie Childs, Henry VIII's final victim, and it's about Henry Howard. And she talks at that point about trying to get out through the toilet, and the Spanish Chronicle is the only one that talks about that. So not sure how true that is, but I think it's a really interesting story and I like it. So I'm going to say it's true for me. Any other questions? It's only 24 minutes in. We can talk about something for the final 15 minutes if nobody else has any questions about escapes of the Tower of London. Okay. Well, I could tell you some more about Father John Gerard. He's a really interesting person. Or we could talk a little bit more about Alice Tankerville. Let's see, do you think that the princes in the tower were the bodies found there? Oh, goodness, that would be another fun escape story, wouldn't it? Yeah, I kind of do. Okay, you heard my episode on that. Thank you. Yeah, and you know, I try not to get into that whole debate about who killed them and were they killed, because I know like Matt Lewis thinks that maybe at least one of them survived. I think they probably were. You know, there's that, Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. And it just seems like kind of simple that Richard would want them dead and that they would be killed that way. And so I'm inclined to believe that, but I'm not wedded to that and I don't believe it emphatically. So I'm quite happy to examine other ideas about that. People get very heated about the princes in the tower, and I've never been one of the people who got particularly heated. So there was another escape that's later than our period from the tower that I think is kind of a fun one, where a guy was in the tower and he escaped by wearing his wife's clothing. His wife brought some extra clothes and he walked right out dressed as a woman, and everybody thought he was a woman, and they didn't realize until he was gone that he had actually escaped. I think that's kind of a funny one too, that his wife was able to bring some extra. What do you know about the ravens at the tower? Isn't there a prophecy that they're not allowed to? Yeah, I don't know that much about the ravens, but I know that they're there forever, and there's that very old prophecy, right? If you want to say something about, sounds like Mr. Toad from Mr. Toad. So it's not that old. Tell me, was the tower still a palace while being used as a prison? Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that, like, Anne Boleyn was a prisoner in the tower, but while she was a prisoner, she was actually being housed in the rooms that she was in before she became a queen. That was customary before the coronation that you go spend the night in the tower, and that's actually how Richard was able to get the princes, Edward V, I suppose it would have been, to the tower, because they said, we're going to put him there before his coronation. and he'll spend his time there and then go be crowned afterwards. And then, of course, he never came out. But yeah, it was a palace while it was also a prison. And there weren't really that many prisoners that were kept in the tower. It was the really high up ones. Yeah, it's still a fully functioning village. Lots of people live there. It is. I went there a couple of years ago. There was a choir that was launched, the Aura Singers, and they launched in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. And I was there at night after after the tourists had left. And it was so interesting because I was walking back out and I thought it was going to be this scary place, with these kind of ghosts wandering around. But it wasn't, because it was like you say, Luke, it was this little village with lots of people. There were lights on in the buildings, and people living there. It was really interesting. So yeah, it's been a palace, and even when it was a prison, and like I say, it wasn't really a prison that much. There were lots of other prisons that people would go to, but the tower was for the really important ones. I think Alice was and John Wolfe were kept there. Normally, they wouldn't have been kept in the tower. They were way too low key, but because of the involvement in the Hanseatic League, Henry had really wanted to keep happy, and so he wanted to show that he was taking them seriously. And so that's why a criminal like that would have been kept in the tower. Normally they wouldn't have gone to the tower, but it was because it was a bit of an international event that had happened there, with that money being stolen. The Hanseatic League was this amalgamation of German principalities, and Henry needed to decide because this was right when he was leaving Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope was really mad at him, and all the Catholic countries were really mad at him. And so the Hanseatic League was much more Protestant, and so he needed to keep them on his side. And so he wanted to show that he was taking the theft of this £1 million very seriously. So, child from the Disney movie. Anything else? Guy that tried to get out of the toilet. So funny. Poor Earl of Surrey trying to get out by the toilet. You've got to be quite desperate, don't you, to have to escape from the toilet. So the punishment for Alice waiting to be drowned in the Thames seems pretty harsh. It does. It was mostly because the crime had happened on the water, which made it piracy, and so that was punished a lot harsher. That was in a different court, the Admiralty Court, and so they had harsher punishments for the crimes that happened on the water, crimes that happened on the sea or in the river. So I think it's kind of interesting that one event makes her a pirate. I'm trying to think of some of the other tower escapes, even from later. Did any animals escape from the menagerie? I need to think about that. I need to think about that. I did this episode like 3 years ago on the menagerie, and I feel like at that point that there was. Do you know, Luke? I'd love to know if you knew. I feel like there was a lion that maybe at one point had gotten loose, but I don't know whether I just am dreaming that. They had all kinds of animals though, and some of them did not thrive. Yeah, having an elephant loose. Yeah, they did have an elephant at the menagerie, and it was interesting because some of the letters talk about how that some of the animals weren't thriving, because like the polar bear, like what are you going to do with a polar bear in London? I mean, I know London's cold, but it's not polar bear cold. And so some of the animals had a hard time, and then the other side of it, more tropical animals. But it was a thing that the kings and queens would send each other gifts, and so they would get gifts. I think it was from the King of Norway gave him the polar bear, and so they had this menagerie, and it was you could go, just the public could go like on a Sunday afternoon and look at the animals, and of course they were treated horribly, and it's really hard to to think about the way they were treated. But yeah, they didn't know any better, really. Not that cold. We're bathed in light right now. Well, good for you. I'm in southern Spain and it's thunderstorming and it's really cold. So you're probably warmer than Andalusia right now. Um, but I've been in London in November and it's not a pleasant place. Yeah, I can imagine the polar bear might have thought it is. But there's not really any place more beautiful than England in June, really. That probably makes up. You got to pay for it in November though. So yeah, I don't think any animals ever escaped from the menagerie in the tower. Just 40, I think it's interesting that it was being used as a prison even up until World War II, right? That's something that I think of the tower as a prison. It was really in its heyday of prisonness during the 15th and early 16th century. So it was the Tudors who really made use of it as a prison. The rest of the monarchs didn't make as much. When you look at the list of prisoners in the tower, there's websites that list all the different prisoners. There's a huge chunk of them just from the 15th and 16th century. So you can rent bits out for corporate events now. Yeah, I know. That's kind of funny that you can do that. Yeah, I went to this concert there and it was funny because it was at 7 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night and all the tourists had left and I had to walk up and tell them my name and what I was doing and walk through and it was so weird like walking through because it was all the way to the chapel from the side, the main entrance, and it was just a very eerie. I felt like there was all of these people around me, which maybe they were. I don't know. But yeah, you can rent bits out for corporate events and all kinds of stuff. Why was that lone soldier in World War II put in the tower? There were actually several soldiers during World War II that were put in the tower. He was just the one that happened to have been that happened to have escaped. There were several prisoners during World War II that were put in the tower. Yeah, he wasn't the only one to be court-martialed. He had been um, he had been British, and then yeah, Rudolf Hess was held in the tower. Yeah, he was, exactly. This one had been British, and then he fought for the Germans, I believe, and then he was brought back and like repatriated and then put in the tower. So that was his story. But yeah, Rudolf Hess was also kept in the tower. It's interesting. Interesting. So, all right, I have 1:35 for you guys. 7:35 for me. Any other questions? We've got a couple of minutes here. Thank you so much for coming to my talk, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day, rest of your conference. I'm looking forward to so many more of these talks. Thanks for watching mine, for sure. Thank you for sharing these fun stories with us. You are welcome. Thank you, Bill, for listening to my show. Thank you. I think you're the one who said you were listening for a while. And I know a lot of you listen, so thank you if you listen to my show. If you don't, it's the Renaissance English History Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you for coming, and thank you for coming to this event. Thank you to the people who were putting on the event. So much work went into this, so I'm really honored to have been part of it. And I'm so glad that you guys are here. So I guess we'll call it a day unless anybody has anything else they want to chat about. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you guys. I'll see you around the rest of the day. Bye.